Last night, multiple states held their primary elections for the 2026 November elections. These states included states such as Wisconsin and Minnesota. We also seen a special primary election happen in the state of South Carolina, as well as others. But the most important result may have been out of the Wisconsin governor's primary election, specifically on the Democratic side. David Crowley, who I predicted before the race would end up losing this race by a much narrower margin than what polls said, but I still predicted he would lose, actually won last night. He won this race, and he will go on to face off in the general election. Now, this is extremely important because Democrats up and down the ballot were hoping that David Crowley would win this race. Francesca Hong was a much more progressive Democratic candidate, a Democratic socialist, who Democrats feared had an opportunity to actually lose this race in a Democratic environment. But ultimately, that's not the case. David Crowley will face off in the November election. He is the Democratic nominee, and that's going to be really important for Democrats up and down the ballot in Wisconsin. So with that said, let's take a look at the historical odds in Wisconsin. So if we date back to 2018, the last midterm similar to this one where President Trump was in office, Tony Evers won against incumbent Scott Walker by 1.1% back in 2018. Fast forward to 2022, in a Republican, what was supposed to be a Republican environment, Tony Evers still won this race by 3.4%. And in 2026, we fully expect, now that David Crowley is the nominee, he should win this race. Given the environment, the historical odds, the odds are in his favor for this seat. Francesca Hong, on the other hand, wouldn't have been as likely to have won this seat if she had faced off in the November election. But ultimately, that's not the case. David Crowley will face off in November. But I want to take a look, too, at the polling conducted in this race leading up to the primary result. I told you guys on Monday when I made a video about this race that Hong was certainly here as a favorite candidate to win the primary election. However, that ended up not being the case. Hong, in most Democratic primary polls, was leading by 22 points, 18 points, 19 points, 25 points. And two of those polls were conducted by David Crowley Democratic-sponsored polls. But ultimately, it did not matter. David Crowley still won this race, narrowly by less than half of a percentage point, but ultimately still won, and will still go to face off in the November election. Now, with all of that said, we have to have a serious conversation about the polling conducted that completely overestimates Democratic Socialists. It happened last week in the state of Michigan, and it happened this week in the state of Wisconsin. If I'm being truthful and honest, I wasn't planning on making a video on this race. As I said last week with Michigan, I wasn't planning on making another video about that race. But the trajectory of the race made it impossible to continue to talk about other races without acknowledging this fact that Hong was leading by 18 to 22 percentage points in most polling, yet ultimately is going to end up losing that primary race. David Crowley, on the other hand, going to be that Democratic nominee. This is going to be huge for Democratic Socialists on the November election too, because if people are saying that they're going to get out and vote and they're not actually voting, if that's what's happening in the polling, there could be another reason. But if that's what's happening, that's going to spell major alarms for the Democratic Party in states like Michigan, where we have Abdul Al-Sayed running the Senate race in the November election as a much more progressive wing candidate. Is he going to be able to overcome the odds and actually win the November election? Of course, he did it in the primary, but it was still narrowly. The polling said that he was up way more than he actually was. Similar situation in this Wisconsin governor's election. But if we look at the November election, we see David Crowley certainly a better candidate to run against Tom Tiffany, and that's not really much of a surprise. When we talked about this race on Monday, I acknowledged that fact as well, that Tom Tiffany had a much better shot against someone like Hong than he did against someone like Crowley. And now Republicans are having to question mark how they continue this campaign when they're not going to be running against a Democratic socialist, as they predicted they would be leading up to this primary race. David Crowley, going to be a much more moderate candidate, someone who Democrats appeal to on a larger sense of independent voters, and of course, Democrats as a whole, moderate Democrats. It's going to be a very big question on how the Republican Party shifts this race to run against David Crowley instead of Hong. So we'll have to see how that shapes out and what that may look like. But ultimately, at this point, it's going to spell a major alarm sign for Republicans as well, who predicted that they would be running against Hong. Now they're not. Now they are running against David Crowley, who narrowly won this primary, sure, but still won it, and will still face off against them in the November election. And finally, I want to take a look at another race out of the state of Minnesota. Peggy Flanagan actually won this primary to represent Minnesota in the Senate, and she won the Democratic primary for that race against Angie Craig. And this was actually a pretty large victory for Peggy Flanagan, winning by almost 20 percentage points across the board. But ultimately, Angie Craig losing this race, not much of a surprise there. Peggy Flanagan, I think, always was kind of the more favored candidate, at least from the little bit of research that I had done on the race. I actually have never made a full video on it. But Peggy Flanagan ultimately will go on to face off in the November election. Peggy Flanagan, again, being one of these more progressive wing Democrats who's endorsed by Bernie Sanders, AOC, people such as that who really pushed for her candidacy, and ultimately she wins this primary by a large number. So that's a real big question too, is why are Democratic, socialist, progressive wing Democrats able to win in a state like Minnesota by a large margin on the Democratic primary level, but not in a state like Wisconsin or not in Michigan? It's a big question to be asked, but certainly one that didn't matter here. You know, Angie Craig losing this race by roughly 20%. And Peggy Flanagan going on to be the Democratic nominee face off in the November election. So, with all of this said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys believe that these races are really going to matter? Do you believe Peggy Flanagan is a weaker candidate to run in the November election, of course, here in Minnesota? And what do you think about this news out in the race for Wisconsin governor, where David Crowley wins? Do you guys believe that that's good news for Democrats, or do you believe that Republicans can still win this race, even running against someone like David Crowley? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I would love to read through your thoughts and reply back to you guys, see what you guys are thinking. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys again so much for watching.